This morning on Thursday, New York Attorney General Letitia James filed a lawsuit against the National Rifle Association aimed at dissolving the powerful organization. An 18-month-long investigation found that the NRA leaders diverted funds to pay for personal expenses like family trips, contributing to a loss of more than $64 million in the last 3 years alone. The NRA has responded to by filing a counter lawsuit, accusing the Attorney General of violating the organization's First Amendment rights. Gun reform activist David Hogg hailed the Attorney General's action as a victory for victims of gun violence all across the country, and he joins me now. He's the co-founder of March for Our Lives and also a survivor of the Stoneman Douglas shooting. Also with us is Brandon Wolf. He's a survivor of the Pulse nightclub shooting. In the future, I hope we never have to do these types of segments where we have multiple survivors of multiple recent mass shootings. But David, I feel like what the Attorney General of New York has done is a big step in the right direction in terms of holding one of the most powerful lobbying organizations accountable for alleged corruption. What's your reaction to what the Attorney General announced this week?
I think it's a really big step forward. We're certainly going to have a lot more work to do ahead. I wanted to especially thank Tish James, the Attorney General. As a public official, we've seen time and time again how it is not easy to stand up to an organization that believes it is not, that it is above the law. And Tish James, with her courage, has showed that quite otherwise, in that, NRA members should not have their charitable donations spent on things like private jet vacations or almost nearly $300,000 for Italian suits. On top of that, I'm really happy that March for Our Lives filed a complaint with the New York Attorney General about the NRA's fraudulent spending back in 2018, and the result, in part because of that, this investigation, could have happened. So yeah, I think it's a big step in the right direction, but I think this is just one of many steps that we're gonna have to take, sadly, over the next, hopefully a couple of years, but possibly the next couple of decades, not only to address the NRA and their role in gun violence, but also the roles of systemic racism, militarism, and poverty in the United States, and how those things play into gun violence on a daily basis across the country.
Yeah, it feels like in terms of how this issue is being talked about, I think March for Our Lives, which you co-founded, is doing that intersectional organizing across generations, understanding that gun violence can happen in so many different forms. And also, the Pulse nightclub shooting, I think, is a specific example of the reason why we need to have intersectional organizing around these issues, because systemic racism and bigotry also play into this issue. In terms of your reaction, similarly to David, I'm sure you were pleased to see some action taken against the NRA. But in terms of where we go forward as citizens, in terms of the conversation, what ways do you think we can improve how we even talk about the issue of gun violence? Because I think the way in which we talk about it, we always have the same thoughts and prayers, after every shooting. But I think that we need to talk about racial justice and systemic racism even more when these mass shootings occur.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I thought this was going to be an NRA is over party, so I hope you don't mind. I brought a little sparkling something. I put it here for you. Just a little sparkling cider to celebrate the moment.
I would have brought mine.
But in truth, this moment is extremely personal for me. On June 12th of 2016, I escaped through an emergency exit when a man charged into Pulse and opened fire. My two best friends were exactly where they always were. They were standing in the center of the dance floor underneath a disco ball, and they suffered 19 gunshot wounds between the two of them. Neither one of them never made it home to say goodbye to their parents. And it's, I want to make it clear that the NRA fought for the rights of that shooter to buy a weapon of war. The NRA fought for his right to buy all the ammunition he could pack into his car. The NRA fought to militarize a man that everyone knew was dangerous, so dangerous, in fact, that he wasn't allowed on an airplane multiple times, and put us in the crosshairs instead. The NRA has done for years what they did that brought us to Pulse, and that is they fought for gun manufacturers at the expense of American values, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. 6 days after the shooting at Pulse, we held a funeral service for my best friend Drew, and I was one of the pallbearers that day. When we got to the front of that church with his casket, I looked down and I made a promise to him. And that is that I would never stop fighting for a world that he could be proud of. That world has no room for the NRA. And it's also a world, to your point, Zerlina, where we have to talk about the intersections of racial justice and gun violence. We have to talk about the intersections of poverty and gun violence. We have to talk about what is driving a culture of militarization, violence, hatred, and bigotry across the country. And that starts with the violence and bigotry and hatred coming out of the top of this country, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and the mouths of the sycophants of this president.
Amen.
Absolutely. David, one of the things that you have been focused on in recent months is voting, because we know that we're not going to make any legislative changes on this issue until we have different people in Congress, because the people in Congress have showed us time and again that they're not willing to take action, at least in the Senate. To be specific. So in terms of, voting in November, I think a lot of, older voters are like, oh, young people never vote. They never turn out. We always talk about them, but they never show up. And I always say, I think this election is going to be different. And 2018 proved that it's going to be different because of the high increase in youth turnout. How are you feeling in this moment about the level of education for young people in terms of mail-in voting access, and also being able to connect voting to improving the laws that apply to gun violence going forward? How do you think young voters are taking all of this in?
I think they're taking it in, and they're not just voting, they're seeing the importance of going out there and protesting, and as John Lewis talked about, creating good trouble and making those in power uncomfortable. I think our generation is beginning to realize the intersectionality and overlap of racial justice, climate justice, and gun violence as well, and realizing that this is something that we need to take to the streets, but we also need to take it to the ballot box and make our voice heard in the first place to elect the right people to do the right thing. I think a great example of that is Tish James. She is an elected official in New York who took action, and although I'm not a fan of a lot of elected officials, she's an example of exactly what we need more of in this country. As many people say, politicians with the courage to stop and act against gun violence in the first place. So, in 2018, we also saw a massive voter turnout at a near record high for young people turning out, and with gun violence is one of their top priorities. And we see this year how, of course, with everything that has happened, with recent protests and everything, that racial justice is a top priority. And I want people to realize that gun violence also is a racial justice issue, and that one of the top predictors of where gun violence occurs the most in the United States is where communities were redlined in the 1930s and 40s oftentimes. And it's no mistake that the communities that are most affected by racial injustice and poverty and militarism and face the most of that are also the most affected by COVID. And it's because we have a systemic problem in this country that is still very much here, whether or not people choose to recognize it, of structural racism that must be addressed from both outside and within the system. And we need to look at ourselves as Americans and ask ourselves, are we really doing the best that we can do, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as human beings, to create a better country for future generations? And I believe that we can create one, and one that values the lives of children more than inanimate objects, and protects children and not those inanimate objects. And that's why it's so important that we not only vote, but go out and protest.
Brandon, I heard it's your birthday tomorrow. So
It
quickly
is.
here, I wanted to ask you, what do you want for your birthday in terms of gun violence legislation?
The first thing that I want to do is the entire country to wish the NRA our sincerest thoughts and prayers. My hope is that they're just as effective for the NRA as they were for my best friends on June 12th, 2016. And I really, really hope that for my birthday, every single person considers going online, going to their state or county website for elections, figuring out how you can vote in the safest way possible, vote by mail, early vote, whatever that is. Please, if you do anything for my birthday, if you get any gift, it's please have your voice heard at the ballot box.
I love that. Thank you, David Hogg and Brandon Wolf. That's our show.